greatest living legends. A man who spent 6 decades crafting performances that defined American film, who's won every award worth winning, who's worked with every director worth working with, walks onto a late-night talk show expecting the usual promotional banter, only to discover that the host has prepared an ambush disguised as comedy. When someone whose entire career has been built on artistic integrity and refusing to compromise encounters a comedian who believes that political activism gives him license to attack guests under the guise of entertainment. When a conversation that should have been about movies becomes a referendum on politics, respect, and whether Hollywood's elite can ever just discuss their work without being forced to perform political loyalty tests on national television. What you're about to witness is not just another celebrity interview gone wrong, not just another moment of late-night tension, not just another instance where a host pushed too hard and a guest pushed back. This is the moment Robert De Niro, the Raging Bull himself, the Godfather Part 2 legend, the 2-time Oscar winner who spent his entire career letting his work speak louder than his words, finally had enough of being treated like a political prop rather than an artist. This is Jimmy Kimmel discovering that not every Hollywood icon will sit quietly while their appearance gets hijacked for political comedy that stopped being funny and started being preachy years ago. The interview had been booked months in advance, part of the promotional tour for De Niro's latest film, a passion project he'd spent years developing, working with a director he admired, telling a story that mattered to him beyond just another paycheck. His publicist had confirmed with Kimmel's producers, focus on the movie, keep it light, give Bob the respect his legacy deserves. Standard protocol for hosting a legend whose career began before most of the production staff were born. But Jimmy Kimmel had other plans. In the writer's room that afternoon, surrounded by his team of comedy writers who'd spent the Trump years turning every interview into political commentary, Jimmy had made a decision. De Niro had been vocal about politics in the past. Why not lean into that? Why waste this opportunity on boring movie promotion when you could create a viral moment, get headlines, maybe even make some actual news instead of just facilitating another forgettable celebrity interview? What Jimmy failed to calculate was that Robert De Niro hadn't survived 6 decades in Hollywood, hadn't become one of the most respected actors in film history, hadn't built an untouchable legacy by letting anyone, producers, directors, or late-night comedians, tell him how to perform or what to say. And when someone who commands that level of respect feels disrespected, when someone who's earned the right to control their narrative has that control taken away, when dignity gets sacrificed for someone else's idea of good television, there are consequences. This isn't about whether you agree with De Niro's politics or Kimmel's, whether you think celebrities should use their platforms for activism or stick to entertainment, whether you find political comedy brave or tiresome. This is about what happens when a host forgets that the relationship between interviewer and guest requires mutual respect, when entertainment crosses the line into exploitation, when someone finally says enough and walks away rather than participate in their own diminishment. Jimmy Kimmel thought he was creating a moment that would trend on social media, that would get his name in headlines, that would prove his show was still relevant in an oversaturated late-night landscape. What he created instead was a masterclass in how to alienate a legend, lose the respect of an audience, and demonstrate that sometimes the person who walks away from a situation is the one who actually wins. Because when Robert De Niro walks out of your show, when one of the greatest actors in American history decides your stage isn't worth standing on, that says something about your show that no amount of spin can fix. Buckle up, because what you're about to witness isn't just explosive television. It's a cultural moment that revealed the rot at the heart of late-night comedy, the exhaustion with constant politicization, and what happens when someone who's earned the right to be treated with dignity finally stops tolerating anything less. The Jimmy Kimmel Live studio carried its familiar energy that evening, the audience filing in with excited anticipation, the band warming up with their usual pre-show riffs, the lighting crew making final adjustments to ensure every camera angle would be perfect. This was a big booking. Robert De Niro didn't do late-night appearances often, and when he did, it was an event. The audience knew they were about to see a legend, someone whose filmography read like a history of American cinema's greatest achievements. Backstage, De Niro sat in his dressing room with that quiet intensity that everyone who'd worked with him recognized. At 80 years old, he still carried himself with the presence that had made him one of the most compelling screen presences in film history. His publicist went over the schedule one more time. They'd talk about the new film, maybe discuss working with the director, share a funny story from set, keep it light and promotional. Standard late-night protocol. What neither De Niro nor his team knew was that in Jimmy's dressing room, a very different conversation was happening. The host and his head writer were going over notes that had nothing to do with De Niro's film and everything to do with his past political statements, his criticism of certain politicians, his willingness to speak bluntly about issues he cared about. "We can't waste this," Jimmy was saying, gesturing at his notes. "He's been outspoken before. Let's actually talk about something that matters instead of just another boring movie interview." His head writer looked uncertain. Bob's people were pretty clear about keeping it focused on the film. "Bob's people don't produce this show," Jimmy interrupted, that edge in his voice that his staff recognized as the tone that meant discussion was over. "We'll talk about the movie, sure, but we're also going to have a real conversation. That's what makes good television." What Jimmy called real conversation, De Niro would soon recognize as something else entirely: an ambush, designed to turn a promotional appearance into political theater, regardless of whether the guest had agreed to participate. The show's opening monologue went as planned, Jimmy delivering his usual mixture of political jokes and celebrity gossip to warm applause from an audience that knew what they were getting. And then came the introduction. Jimmy's voice taking on that reverent tone that hosts use when introducing genuine legends. "Our next guest needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway because his resume is just that incredible. Two-time Academy Award winner, 7-time Oscar nominee, star of The Godfather Part 2, Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, Goodfellas. Honestly, I could keep going for the entire show. Please welcome the legendary Robert De Niro." The audience erupted as De Niro walked out, that familiar slight smile on his face, waving to the crowd with understated acknowledgement of their enthusiasm. He shook Jimmy's hand, settled into the guest chair with practiced ease, and prepared for what he assumed would be a pleasant conversation about his work. "Bob, thanks so much for being here," Jimmy began, and his tone was warm, welcoming, giving no indication of what was coming. "I want to talk about the new film, but first I have to say you look great. What's your secret?" De Niro smiled slightly. "Good lighting and talented cinematographers." The audience laughed, appreciating the self-deprecating humor from someone who could have easily taken the compliment seriously. Jimmy laughed too, seeming to relax into what appeared to be developing into exactly the kind of easy conversation that both parties had expected. "So the new film," Jimmy continued, "you've been working on this project for what, 3 years now? Tell us about it." De Niro leaned forward slightly, his body language showing genuine enthusiasm for discussing something he cared about. "It's a story I've wanted to tell for a long time. It's about—" "Before we get into that," Jimmy interrupted, and something in his tone shifted subtle enough that the audience might not have noticed, but De Niro's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "I have to ask you about something you said a few months ago at that awards ceremony. You made some pretty strong comments about—" "I'm here to talk about the film," De Niro said, his voice still calm but with an edge now, a warning that anyone familiar with his work would recognize as significant. Jimmy smiled, but it was his television smile now, not his genuine one, the expression he wore when he was performing rather than actually connecting. I know, and we'll get to that. But you've been pretty vocal about politics, and I think the audience would love to hear." "The audience," De Niro interrupted, "is here because you told them I'd be talking about my new movie. That's why I'm here. To talk about the film." The tension in the studio was suddenly palpable, the easy atmosphere evaporating as the audience sensed something shifting from promotional interview into something else entirely. Jimmy's smile stayed fixed, but his eyes showed calculation. He'd invested in this direction, committed to it in front of his writers, and backing down now would mean losing face. "Come on, Bob," Jimmy said, trying to make it sound like friendly banter. "You can't come on a talk show and expect us not to talk about the things you've said publicly. That's not how this works." "Actually," De Niro replied, his voice dropping lower, and anyone who'd seen his dramatic performances knew that when De Niro got quiet, that's when you should pay closest attention. "That's exactly how this works. I agreed to come on your show to promote a film. My team communicated that clearly to your producers. If you wanted a political discussion, you should have been honest about that instead of ambushing me on live television." The word ambush landed heavily, hanging in the air between them. Jimmy's smile faltered completely now, replaced by something defensive, almost aggressive. "Ambush? That's a strong word. I'm just asking questions that I think people want to hear answered." "No," De Niro said flatly. "You're trying to turn a promotional interview into political theater because you think it'll get you headlines. That's not journalism, Jimmy. That's exploitation." The audience was completely silent now, the comfortable expectation of entertaining banter having transformed into the uncomfortable witness of a genuine confrontation. This wasn't scripted back and forth or playful tension, this was real, and getting more real by the second. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, trying to reclaim some authority. "Look, Bob, I respect you tremendously." "If you respected me," De Niro interrupted, "you'd be talking about my work instead of trying to get me to perform for your political audience. If you respected me, you wouldn't have lied to my team about what this interview would be." "We didn't lie to anyone. You said we'd discuss the film. That was the agreement. And now, 5 minutes into this appearance, you've spent more time on politics than on the project I actually came here to promote." De Niro's voice remained controlled, but there was steel underneath. "That's not respect, Jimmy. That's bait and switch." Jimmy's defensive posture shifted into something more aggressive, perhaps sensing he'd already committed to this direction and might as well see it through. "You know what, Bob? You've made millions of dollars from an industry and an audience that has political opinions. You've been pretty happy to share yours when it suited you. Don't act like you're above all this now." De Niro's jaw tightened visibly. "There's a difference between choosing to speak about issues I care about on my own terms and being ambushed on a talk show that promised one thing and delivered another. You understand that difference, don't you? Or has the need for viral moments completely eroded your sense of basic professional courtesy?" The tension had escalated from uncomfortable to genuinely hostile now. Jimmy's face was flushing red, partly from embarrassment at having his tactics called out so directly, partly from anger at being challenged on his own show in front of his own audience. "Professional courtesy?" Jimmy repeated, his voice rising. "You've called people some pretty harsh things in your political statements. Where was your professional courtesy then?" "When I speak about politics," De Niro said, his voice dangerously quiet now, "I do so in contexts where political discussion is expected and appropriate. Political events, political fundraisers, political interviews where everyone knows what we're there to discuss. I don't hijack someone else's platform under false pretenses." He leaned forward, and the intensity of his gaze, the same intensity that had made him one of the most compelling actors ever to appear on screen, focused entirely on Jimmy. "What you're doing right now. This isn't brave political comedy. This isn't speaking truth to power. This is a host who apparently can't just have a normal conversation with a guest without turning it into some kind of political performance for your increasingly small audience." The jab about the audience size clearly landed. Jimmy's ratings had been slipping for years, as had most late-night shows, and having it pointed out by Robert De Niro on live television was not part of his plan for how this evening would go. "My audience is doing just fine," Jimmy said defensively, "and they appreciate when we have real conversations instead of just promotional puff pieces." "Real conversations," De Niro repeated, and there was something almost pitying in his tone now. "Is that what you call this? Because from where I'm sitting, this feels like someone who's so desperate to stay relevant, so desperate to prove his show still matters, that he's willing to disrespect a guest who came here in good faith. The audience was barely breathing now, transfixed by watching one of cinema's greatest actors systematically dismantle a talk show host on the host's own stage. This wasn't the kind of conflict that could be laughed away or edited for comedy. This was genuine, personal, and escalating with every exchange. Jimmy's band leader shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure whether to try to inject some musical break to ease the tension, or stay silent and let whatever was happening play out. The cameras kept rolling because what else could they do? This was live television at its most unpredictable and uncomfortable. "You know what, Bob?" Jimmy said, and his voice had taken on that particular quality of someone who's committed to a bad position and determined to defend it. "Maybe if you didn't want to discuss politics, you shouldn't have been so vocal about them in the first place. You can't have it both ways." "I can absolutely have it both ways," De Niro replied with calm certainty. "I can speak about issues I care about in appropriate contexts, while also expecting that when I agree to do a promotional interview about a film, the host will honor that agreement. Those aren't contradictory positions, Jimmy. That's just basic honesty." He stood up then, and the movement was so sudden and decisive that it took everyone by surprise: the audience, Jimmy, the production staff scrambling in the control room. De Niro began removing his microphone with practiced efficiency, the same careful attention to technical details that had characterized his approach to craft throughout his entire career. "What are you doing?" Jimmy asked. And there was genuine panic in his voice now, as he realized his big booking was about to become his biggest embarrassment. "I'm leaving," De Niro said simply, setting the microphone carefully on his chair. "I came here to discuss a film I'm proud of, to talk about the work we did, to maybe share some stories from set. Instead, I got ambushed by a host more interested in using me as a prop for his political comedy than treating me like an artist with something to offer beyond sound bites." "Bob, come on," Jimmy started, standing up himself now, trying to physically block De Niro's path, or at least create the appearance of still being in control. "Don't be so sensitive. We're just having a conversation." "No, Jimmy," De Niro interrupted, and his voice carried absolute finality. "You're trying to have a conversation you want to have, with no regard for what I agreed to, or why I'm here. That's not a conversation. That's a monologue that you expected me to participate in." He moved toward the edge of the stage, his body language conveying such complete dismissal that Jimmy's attempts to continue engaging looked increasingly desperate. The audience didn't know how to react. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed supportive of De Niro, a few appeared confused about what was happening and why. "You walk out now, you're proving you can't handle being challenged," Jimmy called after him, making one last attempt to regain some narrative control by framing De Niro's exit as weakness rather than principle. De Niro paused and turned back, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 6 decades in an industry that had tried every possible way to compromise his integrity and failed every time. "I've handled being challenged my entire career, Jimmy. Real challenges, directors who pushed me, roles that demanded everything I had, critics who questioned my choices. What I won't handle is being disrespected by someone who mistakes controversy for content." He gestured at the stage, the lights, the whole apparatus of late-night television. "You've got your cameras, your audience, your platform. Use it however you want. But you'll use it without me, because I don't participate in bad faith. I never have, and I'm not starting now at 80 years old to help your ratings." The audience began to applaud then, not everyone, but enough that it was unmistakable. They were applauding De Niro, applauding his refusal to be used, applauding someone finally saying what perhaps many of them had felt about the constant politicization of entertainment. Jimmy's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession: anger, embarrassment, desperation, and finally something that might have been realization that he'd miscalculated catastrophically. "Bob, if you leave, you're not welcome back." De Niro actually smiled at that, a real smile for the first time since the tension had started escalating. "Jimmy, that's the first honest thing you've said all night. And honestly, That's perfectly fine with me. I've got plenty of places to talk about my work where the hosts actually want to discuss my work. He walked off the stage then, leaving Jimmy standing there alone, trying to figure out how to salvage a situation that was beyond salvaging. The band leader looked at Jimmy, waiting for a signal about whether to play, whether to cut to commercial, whether to do anything to ease the excruciating awkwardness that had settled over the studio. "Well," Jimmy said, trying for levity and failing completely, his voice carrying none of his usual practiced charm. "I guess Bob had somewhere else to be." But the audience didn't laugh. The joke fell flat because everyone watching understood that what they'd witnessed wasn't a scheduling conflict or a prima donna moment. It was a legendary actor refusing to compromise his dignity for someone else's idea of good television. Jimmy tried to continue with the show, bringing out his next guest, making jokes about what had happened, attempting to frame it as De Niro being unable to handle direct questions. But the energy in the studio had fundamentally shifted. The audience had watched a host betray the basic compact between interviewer and guest, had seen someone disrespect a legend for clicks and controversy, had witnessed the moment when late-night comedy's obsession with politics finally pushed someone past the breaking point. Backstage, De Niro was already in his car before Jimmy had finished his next segment. His publicist was on the phone doing damage control, but Bob stopped her. "There's no damage," he said quietly. "I came to discuss the film. The host wanted to discuss politics instead of honoring our agreement. I left. That's the story, and I'm comfortable with it." Within minutes, clips of the confrontation began circulating online. Number Robert De Niro started trending worldwide. The reactions split along predictable lines. Some praised Jimmy for trying to have real conversations. Others condemned him for ambushing a guest. But a significant majority, including many who'd never agree on politics, seemed to respect De Niro's decision to walk rather than participate in something he hadn't signed up for. Film critics and entertainment journalists began weighing in, many noting that De Niro's walkout represented something larger, a growing exhaustion with late-night television's inability to just let entertainment be entertainment, to let artists promote their work without forcing them through political litmus tests, to respect the boundaries that guests set for their appearances. Jimmy's show, which had been struggling in ratings for years, took an immediate hit. Publicists for other major stars began quietly reconsidering bookings, weighing whether the promotional value was worth the risk of similar ambushes. The incident became a case study in how not to treat guests, how not to conduct interviews, how not to confuse your platform's purpose with your personal agenda. In the days that followed, Jimmy offered a half-hearted explanation rather than an apology, suggesting De Niro had been overly sensitive and that political discussion was fair game for anyone who'd engaged in it publicly. But the explanation landed poorly, coming across as defensive and tone-deaf to why audiences had responded so negatively. De Niro, meanwhile, appeared on other shows to promote his film shows, whose hosts actually wanted to discuss the work, who treated him with the respect his career had earned, who understood that the compact between guest and host requires honoring what both parties agreed to. On these shows, he was charming, forthcoming, insightful about his craft and his choices. The contrast with the Kimmel appearance couldn't have been starker. The film itself benefited from the controversy in an unexpected way. The walkout had generated far more publicity than a standard promotional interview would have, but more importantly, it had reminded people why they respected Robert De Niro in the first place, not just for his acting, but for his unwillingness to compromise, his insistence on integrity, his refusal to let anyone use him for purposes he hadn't agreed to. The incident sparked broader conversations about the state of late-night television, about whether the constant focus on politics had alienated audiences who just wanted entertainment, about whether hosts had forgotten that their primary job was to make guests look good rather than to use them as vehicles for political commentary. Some defended Jimmy, arguing that celebrities who speak about politics publicly should expect political questions regardless of context. But most observers recognized a crucial distinction. There's a difference between asking political questions when appropriate and hijacking a promotional interview for political purposes after explicitly agreeing not to. The walkout also highlighted the power dynamics in entertainment media. For decades, the assumption had been that celebrities needed late-night shows more than late-night shows needed celebrities. But De Niro's walkout and the overwhelmingly supportive public response demonstrated that power had shifted. In an era of social media, podcasts, and infinite entertainment options, a bad late-night appearance could hurt a show more than it hurt the guest. What made the incident particularly significant was who was involved. This wasn't a young actor making a principled stand early in their career, risking blacklisting or damage to their reputation. This was Robert De Niro, whose legend was so secure, whose contributions to cinema were so undeniable, whose place in film history was so assured that absolutely nothing Jimmy Kimmel said or did could diminish it. That security is what made the walkout so powerful. De Niro didn't need Jimmy's show. He didn't need the exposure. He didn't need to suffer through an ambush interview to sell movie tickets. He had absolutely nothing to lose by standing up for basic respect and honoring of agreements. And when someone with nothing to lose finally says enough, when someone whose reputation can't be damaged refuses to tolerate disrespect, that's when real change becomes possible. The walkout also exposed something uncomfortable about late-night television that many had noticed, but few had articulated clearly. Somewhere along the way, these shows had stopped being primarily about entertainment and started being primarily about politics. They'd stopped trying to appeal to broad audiences and started playing to specific partisan demographics. They'd stopped treating guests as artists with interesting work to discuss and started treating them as political props to be positioned for maximum controversy. Robert De Niro's walkout was a rejection of all of that. It was a statement that entertainment could still just be entertainment, that promotional interviews could still just be promotional interviews, that not every conversation needed to be weaponized for political purposes. It was a reminder that the best moments in show business often come from respecting the craft rather than exploiting it. In the weeks that followed, other actors privately thanked De Niro for what he'd done, for standing up to a system that had made them all uncomfortable, but that most had felt powerless to challenge. His walkout had given them permission to set boundaries, to insist on respect, to remember that they didn't owe any host their participation in formats they hadn't agreed to. Jimmy Kimmel's show continued, of course. But something had changed. Some invisible line had been crossed. The incident became shorthand for everything that had gone wrong with late-night television, the obsession with politics over entertainment, the willingness to betray guest trust for viral moments, the assumption that controversy was more valuable than actual conversation. And Robert De Niro's new film? It did quite well, thank you very much. Audiences who respected his walkout made a point of supporting the work he'd been trying to promote in the first place. Critics who admired his principled stand gave the film more attention than it might have otherwise received. The movie succeeded on its own merits, but the walkout had reminded everyone why they respected the man behind it. The lasting lesson of that evening wasn't about politics or personalities. It was about respect for guests, for agreements, for the basic compact that makes entertainment media function. When hosts honor that compact, everybody wins. When they betray it for clicks and controversy, everybody loses, especially the hosts themselves. Robert De Niro had taught that lesson with characteristic efficiency. He hadn't needed to shout or argue or make a scene. He'd simply refused to participate in something he hadn't agreed to, walked away with his dignity intact, and let the consequences speak for themselves. And those consequences spoke very loudly indeed. They said that legends don't need to compromise. They said that integrity matters more than exposure. They said that sometimes the strongest move isn't fighting back but simply refusing to play a game that's rigged against you from the start. Jimmy Kimmel had wanted a viral moment. He'd gotten one, but not the kind he'd hoped for. Instead of a clip of Robert De Niro making controversial political statements, The internet had been flooded with clips of a legend walking away from disrespect, an audience applauding that walkout, and a host left standing alone on stage trying to explain why he'd just driven away one of the greatest actors in American history. In Hollywood, where reputation is currency and respect is earned through decades of work, Robert De Niro's currency remained as strong as ever. Jimmy Kimmel's? Well, that was a different story entirely. The walkout had become his legacy moment, but not in the way he'd intended. It was the moment when everyone watching learned that even late-night television hosts can push too far, demand too much, and discover that some people simply won't compromise their dignity for anyone's entertainment. Robert De Niro walked off that stage and never looked back. And honestly, he didn't need to. His work spoke for itself. It always had, and it always would. That's the privilege that comes with being a legend. You don't owe anyone anything except the quality of your art. And on that measure, Bob had nothing left to prove.